Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 12th of August, where I wanted to continue talking about Orson Welles. And we know how significant Orson Welles was in terms of radio. It turns out that Orson Welles was also significant in terms of movies, which is today's topic. But before I talk about Orson Welles' significance, I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below, where in the first section, I've just given a few thoughts about the social impact of movies, which I suspect you already know about, that movies have substantial social and cultural impact, and that movies can entertain, they can distract, they can reaffirm, they can educate, they can challenge. Maybe they can do all of the above if it's truly an excellent movie. And the modern day blockbuster, where we think of these incredibly large sets and expenses associated with movies, really started in the 1970s, where we've got these big budget movies. And probably the best known blockbuster would be Star Wars from 1977. And a blockbuster was just that there would be patrons who would be standing around the block, sometimes multiple blocks, waiting to buy theater tickets. Eventually, Blockbuster became a video store that was ultimately displaced by the internet and streaming, as so many other retail industries have been. And in terms of talking briefly about the history, which begins in the 1800s, the ability to manipulate photos to appear to move on screen. And in 1889, the game really changed with celluloid. Being able to put these photos on thin strips of transparent plastic for projection onto a movie theater, or projection onto a movie screen, I should say. And in the late 1800s, we began with single person viewing systems. But in the early 1900s is when we had projection for multiple viewers simultaneously. They were known as Nickelodeons. And some of the early days of the projection resulted in people being so afraid of some of the images they saw, for instance, waves rolling from a beach, that it appeared so realistic that reportedly, audience members actually stepped back so that they wouldn't be hit by the waves. So, 1915, Mary Pickford, very famous actor at the time, said she couldn't afford to work for less than $10,000 a week, really helping to establish the kind of salaries that actors command today. And United Artists, which might be a film production studio that you're aware of, was begun at that time. And the studio system was basically controlling the movie industry with vertical integration, which meant that the studios were responsible for everything associated with a movie, the production, the distribution, and the exhibition. That lasted until the 1950s, where that was broken up, and it's basically being reestablished now with streaming. So, what's considered the first feature-length film would be in 1915, Birth of a Nation, which unfortunately is an incredibly racist film about the KKK, but it has its historical significance in terms of producing what we think of as a feature film. And that led to narrative stories, where films would tell stories in genres and categories, much like literature does. 1920s, movie palaces were built so that movies could be viewed in luxurious environments. In 1930s is when we had talkies, and that completely changed the silent film industry. 1950s is when the film industry really had to differentiate itself from television, where now some of the content that people were accustomed to getting in movie theaters could be televised. There was even such a thing called a made-for TV movie at the time. So basically, movie theaters differentiated themselves by showing much more diversified content than what you would find in television, and also much more adult content that you would find in television as well. 1960s is where we're getting the rise of independent films, where the studio system didn't necessarily have the kind of economic, social, or political hold over movie production. 1970s, not only was that the time of the blockbuster, but the time of what I call the deification of directors. And you might recognize some of these names in today's world: Lucas, Spielberg, Tarantino, for just a small sampling. 1980s would be the height of suburban multiplexes, where there would be multiple theaters in one locale. 1990s is when we had home viewing, really changed the industry with VHS and DVD. But of course, in the 2000s, as we've talked about with so many other industries, there was convergence, leading to the 2010s. Not only streaming, but vertical integration of production once again, where you've got the integration of production, distribution, and exhibition. Netflix, for instance, is a wonderful example that basically is doing everything associated with the movie industry. And as we know, with all of the chapters that we've been talking about, the 2020s is a question mark in terms of how AI is going to be changing that industry and all of the other industries we're going to be talking about. So in terms of films, and of course, films can be very subjective, but the American Film Institute has ranked the top 100 movies. This is a tricky thing to do because, of course, what is the criteria that you use and how do you justify that? But the American film industry and many other top 100 lists have identified the same film as the best film ever made, a film entitled Citizen Kane. And this is in the fourth section in the notes below. And you can click on that link and see that the American Film Institute updated their top 100. And again, Citizen Kane was at the top. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Citizen Kane, which might be a film that you've heard of, or perhaps you haven't heard of, but it's very important in terms of Orson Welles, because Orson Welles starred in the film and he directed the film. And basically, he was responsible for creating what we think of in terms of modern cinema. He helped to write the film as well. And we know that Orson Welles, after his production of War of the Worlds, could have had his career ended. Instead, what he was granted was a Hollywood contract that had never been granted to anybody before, where he would have complete and total control. And the result was the film Citizen Kane, which led to the destruction of Orson Welles' career. So, just a little bit of background about Citizen Kane. It's something that I talk a little bit more about in my film classes, by the way. But Citizen Kane is revolutionary for many reasons. Filming techniques that had never been used before. So, things like deep focus, where everything in a shot could be kept in clear focus, something we take for granted nowadays. But if you think about the time of Citizen Kane, 1941, that was revolutionary. Makeup techniques where actors would age. Again, we take this for granted, but revolutionary for the time. Acting techniques that we take for granted, such as overlapping dialogue, which again we take for granted, revolutionary for the time. Special effects techniques, and we're used to special effects. If you watch Citizen Kane, and you will, more on that in a moment, the special effects are invisible in many respects because Citizen Kane tried to be as realistic as possible and oftentimes had to utilize, remember, no CGI at the time, things like matte drawings in order to give the appearance of sets and locales. And various genres were also encompassed within this film. It is a drama, but it's also a mystery story, and it's also a love story, and there are musical numbers in it, so it basically covers everything. There is an incredible amount of symbolism and thematic significance to the film. So if you are a literary critic, then you can have a lot of fun with talking about all of the symbolism that appears in Citizen Kane. One of the opening shots is a no trespassing sign, which is how the film ends. And of course, we will be trespassing throughout the entire film. That's just one of many symbols. Probably the most important symbol is Rosebud, where we're trying to figure out what exactly is Rosebud? That's the major premise of the movie. And how is it important for us understanding our central character, who is Citizen Kane? The way that we learn about Citizen Kane through the film is through multiple narrators. So we've got a mixed and circular chronology in which the narrators are giving the story, and all of these narrators are unreliable, which also is important from a literary standpoint. How did it end Orson Welles' career? Because of William Randolph Hearst. Now, you might be familiar with this name when we were talking about media moguls and how the current media moguls, such as Rupert Murdoch from Fox, have a long tradition going all the way back to the early days of media with people like William Randolph Hearst, who owned multiple newspapers and magazines and media outlets, and he was quite cutthroat. He was incredibly powerful at the time. And the story of Citizen Kane is loosely, or maybe not so loosely, based on William Randolph Hearst. So much so that when the film was nearing the ending of its production, there was a very small screening that was given, and one of the critics of the time realized that that film was basically based on William Randolph Hearst's life. And that critic went immediately to William Randolph Hearst and told William Randolph Hearst about the movie. William Randolph Hearst indicated throughout his lifetime that he never saw the movie. He only heard about the movie. I find that hard to believe. But basically, William Randolph Hearst, because it was an unflattering portrayal of him, and even more so, an unflattering portrayal of William Randolph Hearst's mistress, that Hearst made it his lifelong mission to kill the movie and to destroy Orson Welles' career. And he was almost successful. So the reality is that Hearst was not able to kill the movie. The movie ended up actually being nominated for Academy Awards, but didn't get any real accolades until long after Orson Welles and Hearst were gone, and that's when it began appearing on the best of lists. And you have to see the movie to truly understand it. Perhaps you have seen the movie before, but I don't know if you've ever seen it critically. Now, you might be familiar with the film critic Roger Ebert, and he gives a wonderful commentary about the film, which I talk about in my film class. But what I've done in the notes below is I've put his written critique of Citizen Kane. But I would like you to watch Citizen Kane first. So that's going to be your assignment for today. Now, Citizen Kane is an hour and 59 minutes, so this is a good long watch. You can find it, of course, on all kinds of streaming services, such as Amazon Prime and YouTube, but I was able to find a link for free on Vimeo, which I've included in the notes below if you want to utilize a free link. And then after you have seen the film, read Roger Ebert's review. Now, again, we could spend an entire semester easily talking about the importance of Citizen Kane and its cinematic techniques. But at least in terms of your understanding of film after viewing it and reading Roger Ebert's critique, the attendance question for today, which will be due on Thursday, the 14th, do you agree or disagree that Citizen Kane is the best movie ever made, and why? And I know that certainly in terms of thinking about modern day films, Citizen Kane might seem dated, but you need to understand that most of the techniques that we utilize in modern day films were initially created for Citizen Kane. Something that is seemingly innocent, like the filming of a ceiling, was revolutionary for the time period. So one of the things that Orson Welles did was he created fake ceilings with muslin, and that hid actually a lot of the recording and the video equipment as well. So you'll see the ceilings look unusually low, and that's one of the reasons why, is because they were fake ceilings, and Orson Welles very much wanted to get those ceilings in the shots. For some of the shots, Orson Welles actually dug holes into the ground so that camera people could actually film from below where the action was occurring. And again, I could go on and on about the techniques with Citizen Kane, but if we're going to be talking about movies and their cultural significance, everybody should have some experience with watching Citizen Kane and understanding its historical importance. So I'm going to leave you now to watch Citizen Kane. If you want to know more about Citizen Kane, you might be interested in taking one of my film classes one day. But if you're not necessarily interested in this genre, I do have two other films to recommend to you because, as you know, I'm a horror buff. And if you want to see two excellent films, the first, which we study in my horror film class, is the film Get Out by Jordan Peele, which gives incredible social and political commentary. And a film that I just saw very recently called Sinners, which is now being streamed. And I believe that this film, Sinners, will be the film that represents the 2020s. In my horror film class, I choose a film to represent each decade, and Get Out is the last film that represents the 2010s. And Sinners, coming out in 2025, I think might be the film for the 2020s. I've been searching around for a good film to represent this particular decade. A superb film, in my opinion. But let's get back to Citizen Kane, and I hope you enjoy the show. Take care. Bye-bye.